In this next exercise, what we're going to do is use the suture pack, the styrofoam packing that came with the micro suture, as something to tie around. It'll help us learn how to tie, as well as give you some feedback as to how tight you can make your stitch. So to make this a little bit easier, we're going to use a little piece of sticky tack and break off a portion of that sticky tack and use that to keep the suture pack stuck to the piece of paper. That's not going anywhere. And you can use any other adhesive if you wanted to do something very similar, although we're going to use sticky tack in future examples. All right, we're going to grab our needle and suture. Now, when you approach the artery, and we're going to pretend that the artery is right here, when you approach it, you always want to approach it from away from you and drag the suture into your field. Get used to that motion of being able to start away and drag the suture into the field. What this does is it gets your suture tail out of your way. You don't want the suture tail to be here and to be tying and then have this get snagged as you go to try. So just get used to that muscle memory, that motion of you're always coming from away. You can exaggerate that motion. This way you don't have to think about it when you're actually tying, because there's already going to be so much to think about. I'm going to re-grab, again, at the junction of 2/3 and 1/3. And I'm going to basically just pass this needle through the edge of the styrofoam. Rotate that around. And I'm going to basically pull my suture through. And notice that I'm keeping my hands relatively close. In microsurgery, you want all of the action to be relatively close to the field. If you're using Akron clamps, like a double opposing Akron clamp for your artery, most of the action should be right here. You're not talking about big movements. So you want to keep these movements relatively limited. Now, one of the first things, and imagine now that I've essentially taken this, that's through the first part, and just for argument's sake here, we'll bring it and pretend that's the other side. And similarly, bring it through. Now, this isn't exactly what we're going to do when it comes to the vessel, but close. When you come to tie, you want to make sure you don't have too long of a strand here. Very commonly, I see trainees have a very, very long strand of this loose end here. We don't want that, because that's going to make it very hard to find and grab, and it'll get stuck. We'll make a loop as we're tying. The most common reason that trainees leave it very long is they're worried that they're going to get it to pull out of the suture if they make an errant movement. You don't need to worry about that so much, because everything we've done up until thus has been to really keep better control of your instruments. You're not going to have random errant movements. You're not going to be moving your arms, flailing them around. Now, before we tie, it's important to pay attention to this loop that we're going to create. The loop is critical. The loop needs to be coming from the tip of your microneedle driver and going up anteriorly into space. You want to make sure that that's always the case. The loop is pointing up. And let me give an example of a loop pointing down. This is the loop. Sorry, that's also pointing up. This would be an example of a loop pointing down, essentially. Tying this way is much more difficult. So again, grab the stitch in such a way you're making a loop, and the loop is pointing up into space. Now, another thing that's important before we go to tie is to make sure that my microneedle driver and my forceps are very close to each other. They're in line with one another, that they're not 90 degrees from one another, that they're in the same plane to the extent that's possible. Sometimes in tight quarters, this isn't always possible. But to the extent that it's possible, this should be your habit, to keep the tips of these relatively close together and to be in one line or in alignment as much as possible with the loop pointing up. Once you're in this position, you don't have a very long tail, right? You can place the tail where you want it to be. You don't have a very long tail. You have a loop that's pointing up. The tip of your needle driver and your forceps are in alignment. Now it's time to make the two throws of your surgeon's knot. And the first stitch should always be a surgeon's knot. And we're going to go 1 and 2. A lot of trainees struggle with making those first two throws of the surgeon's knot. And the reason they struggle is it's much harder to make that if you're in an orientation like this. This becomes hard. As I go to make it, it's slipping out of my way. It's so hard. I don't, how can I do this? I'll get one, I won't get the second one. Make life easier for yourself. Get these in alignment. And now all of a sudden making those surgeon's throws, surgeon's throws are very, very easy. 1, 2. If I want, I can do 3. I can do 4, right? This becomes much easier. And that's the critical thing. So 1, 2. Now it's all about, can I grab this suture? So the first part about grabbing it, that's why we had that previous exercise, is you need to be good at grabbing things and being able to move your forceps around. But the other thing that's important is you can't expect to be able to, with that surgeon's throw, open up your suture, your forceps very much. But just a little bit of an opening, you reach out, you grab, and you pull through. Now, sometimes it's hard to grab because the orientation of your forceps isn't necessarily going to be conducive to the orientation you need to be able to pick something up. And that's where being able to spin your forceps in your hand will allow you better flexibility. So I'm going to spin, lift up, get good control, and hold. You're starting to see the complex task of suturing and grabbing and tying requires all of the fundamentals that we talked about. Now, the next step is to pull these two strands relative to one another and get that surgeon's knot. You can see the double throw here. And you want this first knot to come down flat. I was taught by a wonderful microsurgeon, Justin Sachs, that as I bring this down, I should be pulling the stitch up a little bit as I bring the knot down. Now, if you can see this knot, hopefully you can see this in the video, I'm causing a little bit of an indentation in the styrofoam, and that's what you want. You want an appropriate amount of tension, not too much tension. You put too much, you tie this down too much, you're going to get needle hole bleeding. You make it too loose, you're going to actually not get good opposition of your anastomosis, and that's a critical part. That's the second knot that's going down. And just to show you again, this is, again, the loop pointing up. I go around, I grab, and I can just pull this down. And we can do this over and over again. One knot, two knots, and it can go across, counterclockwise, clockwise, whatever you want. And this exercise is going to be about just doing this motion over and over and over again. You can then grab around your forceps, tie around your needle driver. Same thing. You do that once and twice. Now, a critical part of this is we've made this exercise easier because the sticky tack is holding the styrofoam onto the piece of paper. The next part of this exercise is to get rid of the sticky tack and do the same thing, but without the ability for the styrofoam to not move. And you'll find that that increases the level of difficulty enormously. The reason I want to do that is because in order to prevent the styrofoam from moving, I have to pull equally on both strands. Otherwise, I'm going to translate this. And that's exactly what you want to get in the habit of doing when it comes to actually doing this anastomosis for real. You don't want to translate the vessel. The vessel, the anastomosis, should not move. Not always so easy. There we go. All right, that's about 20 throws.